think what a wonderful array, what a neat, somehow neat array of speakers. You've covered sort of two of the major colonial metropoles in one panel, Paris and London, and then we've sort of anchored it in the present at the same time. So before I say sort of anything, I wanted to just open it up for any questions.
I was thinking about, as we acknowledge that like the architectural canon and traditionally what we've been taught as sort of classic architects we look back on and learn from, as we acknowledge that that needs updating and is being updated to encompass like much wider, much more widely. I was wondering, do you think we need to, like, as people come up, like, sorry, I'm not expressing myself well, and come to know the previous, to know the kind of classical canon to then deconstruct it? Do you think that students beginning need to know what was taught before to then realise why we have to learn it differently? Or do you think that you can sort of skip over the like very white Eurocentric male canon and just go straight to the updated stuff?
It's a really good question, probably without a really good answer. But no, this is a question we've asked ourselves this year yet again. I think, I was probably taught a canon from, in fact, we had, I think, from Mesopotamia to 1800 and then sort of 1800 to, I think it went up to about 1970. But, and that was pretty pure in the way in which it described things. But I think that I still feel it's imperative to understand how architects, how the people shaping the spaces around you have made decisions and where those ideas come from. To bring this to Golnar's presentation briefly, I think, for instance, looking at those Beaux-Arts traditions, they are tremendously resonant of my experience in the work I did in Washington, which comes out of an expo tradition, which is a kind of distillation, simulation of ideas that came from Europe that were then reproduced in a very particular way for very particular purposes. Not in a position of ignorance and not always in a position of criticality, but as a shorthand for describing certain structures of power. But it was a language that they spoke that I think is important to understand the mechanisms, how those relationships occur. Now, you don't have to know everything to understand that, but to study a few things well and to understand them critically, I do think is important. Often in juries where, we're always trying to reinvent the wheel. And, for instance, in housing, people have been battling what a good domestic environment or what a challenging domestic environment might be, possibly forever. And to ignore that body of knowledge or to only treat it critically is also a mistake, because you end up slightly powerless. You end up having to start from first principles at every stage of your education. But I suppose the battle for us is that I come from a Eurocentric education. So how do I responsibly teach an architecture that I don't know enough about? That's one of the problems. I think when I try, particularly in the first year context, maybe less this year than the year before, to cover all this ground, I know I speak with ignorance about certain parts of the world, and that's almost worse. So I think that there's an ongoing question of who do you invite to the table, how do you ask the right questions, and how do you do that from a position of humility?
The way I think about my own experience and the history that I've been taught and what I've had access to is that structures matter more than aesthetics. And I think architectural education has been stuck in cataloging aesthetics and forms and teaching those and finding ways to call them and arrange them along a timeline. But what pervades the changing aesthetics and patterns are actually a pretty stable system, economic system, which manifests colonially, which also has racial dimensions. The architect that I presented today that I was speaking about, when he returned to Cairo, he faced challenges from British faculty who had a grip hold on the architecture school in Cairo University, where they were teaching Beaux-Arts. And he was saying, what does Beaux-Arts have to do with this place that I'm in, that I'm from? And so he became marginalized in his own city, country actually, and that dynamic persists until today. There's a kind of a glare, shine to the new cutting-edge forms that big international offices are offering to places like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, and so on. But the structure that underpins the ability of those architects, most of whom come from Europe, to practice in those places is a particular structure of control, coloniality, and white supremacy. So I feel like perhaps the conversation can veer away from aesthetics and actually engage with a form of critical thinking. I mean, what I wish I was educated in undergrad was not how to draw plans in sections, because you can do that eventually anyways. And with the available tools and technologies, you can just whip it up. But actually to be taught how to think about the structures that underpin the profession, which have to do with colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy. So just a comment to throw out there to think about.
I'd say I 100% agree. I would say probably the school's not known for its plans and sections, I have to say.
I've actually got a question for Rashid. So this parallel that you draw between essentially architecture and the language through which it's taught. I'm kind of embarrassed to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway because I think you just need to walk into the disaster sometimes. But I couldn't help but think about a quote from Victor Hugo when he says, "This will kill that." And he's talking about the emergence of the printing press, essentially, as inevitably going to destroy architecture, because architecture used to be the holder of kind of cultural narrative. And with the printing press, so I kind of apologize for throwing a big, like, heavyweight Eurocentric reference straight into the middle of it. But I wonder if you find that I don't know, the fact that you work between these two worlds of publication and architecture, if you ever feel that there is actually a tension between those two things, and maybe we have lost something when words kind of left the discipline of architecture.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll try to relate it a little bit to me personally. But I believe that, if I understood the question correctly, that language and publications and the potential for, we're going into too many different directions. To understand for it a little bit more, I think the role of language in particular, for me to find the publications that I'm interested in the Arabic language is challenging.
Yeah.
And to find writers and authors that relate to me is equally more challenging, right? And every time I find the right author that speaks to me and inspires me and allows me to understand who I am a little bit better, is exactly what I'm hoping that a lot of people can find those references.
Yeah.
And therefore, if somebody out there that's doing a publication or within the field of architecture that you can relate to and influences the field, I think that's really important, and I hope more and more exists. I mean, there's a treasure just right at Ingrid, if I remember correctly, a bookshop, which you'd all be lucky to find some exceptional publications, magazines, and so forth that inspire.
Yeah.
Did I answer the question?
No. I'm not sure I asked you a question. Actually, I think you answered. I think you said what needed to be said. So let's put it that way.
It's not really a question. It's much more to come back to what you said before. I think what I'm missing in the whole discussion regarding Eurocentrism is much more like the epistemologies within architecture. We forget that, or let's say it another way, let's add another way. In terms of historiography, bringing the Arab world, bringing other part of the world within the architectural historiographies, we are somehow in a good the right on the right path. But in terms of epistemologies, I'm afraid we are still really struggling, because at the end it's about the aesthetics, it's about the forms, it's about trying. It's a new way it's a new Orientalist way at looking at things. And for me, that's the crisis within architecture, that we are not bringing actually the knowledge systems which has been destroyed during the colonial time and post-colonial, and we are still in middle of it. There are many conflicts in the world which are distracting right now these knowledge systems. And we have to bring that back into the institutions. How do we make students aware that knowledge systems have been destroyed, and how do we engage with them back in the context of the university and not outside of the university? Because the students go back then afterwards in offices and they just perpetrate the same old white narrative. And I think that's the moment for me when I see, okay, historiographies, great, we are picking up somehow what we've been not doing the last 20 years. But in terms of epistemologies, there is a huge gap and a huge work to do. Yeah.
Where do we start? I would.
Sorry, it was
maybe it's a
just
question also for you.
Well, no, I mean, I think if I can just jump in here, I mean, I think what's so, you're absolutely right, and I think it's just a consistent theme across. What's so interesting about this panel is it's revealed the means through which the question of epistemology is avoided, right? So one is the dissemination of information, so how information is shared and who gets to have access to that information through language. The other is the question of style and how style becomes flattening in a way it's sort of impose a certain sort of let surreptitiously sneak in an ideological project that implies one place being ahead of another somehow. And finally, the question of pedagogy, of teaching. And it's kind of three sort of neatly defined domains where the institution has acted as a kind of gatekeeper, to use sort of Gen Z lingo. It raises the question of kind of classic post-colonial question of Gayatri Spivak, the Bengali post-colonial theorist. Can the subaltern speak? Can those who have not been allowed to have subjectivity introduce a new perspective? And one can't really imagine that without not gatekeeping or differentially allowing access to language, dissemination, a redefinition of style, and modes of pedagogy. Which leads me to one question I have for you, right? So if I can just sort of move it around, specifically when it comes to style and the question of epistemology and maybe aesthetics as being a way of flattening possibility for plural futures. Did the architect himself adopt these terms for style? Do we have the architect's diaries? So if we do a historiography of the Iranian Beaux-Arts, educated tradition, are they using the terms sort of eclectic or modernist or Islamic or hybrid? Because you sort of categorize them. And I wonder if part of telling that story is whether they adopted those terms themselves, how those terms translated, so the importance of translation. And therefore, if there's a sort of record of diaries or notes that the architect would have kept that would have maybe indicated the struggle, the epistemological struggle between how they might have imagined their oeuvre and the categories that they were sort of gatekeeped to deliver in some way, right? Did they have their own, let's say, relationship with those stylistic categories, that they sort of frustrations, and how may have they evolved over the course of their career?
Very difficult question, because specifically Mohsen Frogi wrote a kind of diaries, but mostly related to his father, because his father was prime minister at that area at that time. And he wrote very few about his architecture. And then, but the point is that just not looking at Mohsen Frogi, but André Godard, one of the architects that I work, he was French, completely French, and he studied in Beaux-Arts, and then he came back to Iran. And he did lots of architecture, And after a while, after maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe, he started to develop a kind of architecture who applied Iranian architecture in a very deep sense. And he was, when he wrote about the Iranian architecture, he just, what is the word? Perish it, or just encourage the students to just don't forget your history or something like this, because he was an educator and teacher in the school, so he had some kind of lectures that was written. But I believe that all of these architects came to, for instance, Beaux-Arts, and they learned architecture there, and the meaning of architecture, a good architecture, was established in their mind. But then when they came back to their countries, to Iran, at that point, it was World War II when Foroughi came back to Iran. So he was in the middle of lots of conflicts. So just he decided, I think that in his architecture, he tried to develop a kind of meaning of nationality, and trying to find something to just like use as an anchor. But maybe when now we look at those kind of architecture and the way that he did architecture, we can say that it was a kind of colonialism that sit in their mind while he was in Beaux-Arts. So he just believed that, okay, we can use the Iranian architecture. As I mentioned, that exactly in the time that Foroughi was in Beaux-Arts, they changed their attitude to the Middle East architecture. They just let students have more sample of this kind of architecture. And he believed that, okay, we can just merge this together, and they came back. Unfortunately, there weren't any very specific kind of text or diary. But I think that, I guess, Gewerkian has something in his diaries about this merging. Yes? Mohammed, yes. I guess we had some other...
There are some.
Yes.
I just wanted to, when Golnar, you were presenting some of the earlier work, and of course being an Iranian as well, there was certain poetic, which is very aligned, going back to language, with the Iranian language, which is the Farsi, which is incredibly, like, it's almost like too poetic just on a daily basis. And so when Rashid said language and architecture, I was like, oh, great. But there was something that I became interested, Rashid, whether, because there's a difference about being very analytical, which is also the structure of PhDs, which is also quite Eurocentric, but also the culture of certain words that don't even exist in English, which are very cultural. It's just the way that culturally you operate. So there's a word in Farsi called taruf. I can't even begin to kind of, these guys will know, but what that means. And my German husband has to make it mechanized in order to understand it. So do I have to ask 3 times before somebody accepts? Or, so it becomes something inherent. And I know in Jordan and Lebanon they have it. And actually the entire planning happens around this issue of taruf, which is part of the language, but is part of the culture as well. And I just wondered if any of your work also looked at how that kind of almost, not intuitive, but the whole aura of the culture, that the way, the language is also cultural, and whether that had an impact in what could be vernacular. I mean, a lot of Persian architecture, vernacular, are incredibly poetic in terms of, the light and the shadows onto the water, and how water moves around the building in different fountains and so on and so forth. And I just wondered whether that's something you looked at as well, in terms of more the cultural. Might not be poetry. I don't know the Arabic language, so.
I think this is such an important point. And I became really interested as I read a lot of these architects, their early works, and what I recognize is that proverbial critique became quite central in the way they would analyze something, right? So a typical proverb would be the grass is always greener on the other side. I mean, that's the base. That is a proverb.
We can hear you. Yeah.
No, but
Carry on.
is the grass is always greener a proverb?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you have all of these, you have, within the Arabic language, you would find these architects would use expressions of this sort and borrow from history and culture and use those ways to not critique, but to voice concern, to think of change and so forth. So this was something that I found personally within a lot of the writing, that proverbial critique became, as much as it could be proverbial critique, it could be poetry on another spectrum. And these were ways of analyzing projects and urban settings and so forth. And I did a lot of translation of those works and tried to index them and try to assess them as coined terms and so forth. So yes, I think, but I wouldn't say that this is exclusively to Arabic or Farsi, but I think in Japan, for instance, that I'm familiar with, for instance, the haiku, the way they would use haiku to use them in the context of the built environment, for instance, is also something that I've observed.
I'm from the Comoros, and the question of the language is very crucial, especially in this context where France is very present in the region. And today, the question of an architectural association is being raised by architects locally, knowing that all of the architects are trained abroad because there's no architectural education in the country. And most of the construction are being made by engineers and master builders that we call fundis. So the question of even the term architect is very vague. So I was questioning myself. I was asking myself, how do we form an architectural association without knowing, without having a term, a Comorian term for the word architects? So I was looking at the language. I couldn't find any term. I was looking as well as the closest language, which is the Swahili, and I found several possible terms. One is very close to muhandis, which is mwandishi za majengo, and mwandishi in Swahili means author or composer. So I found that it was like a very poetic, but also a very interesting name to use for this profession. And I think that the language is very crucial, and the practice of publication is also very important, especially when there is no how can I say this? There is no archives or frames of traditional practices of buildings, of architecture, and I think this is very crucial to have today. This practice of archiving rituals of buildings, etc. And the vocabulary is very important, especially when we speaking of regulation codes. They are mostly, I won't say copy and paste from French frameworks, but almost. So it's very important to look at internal and local terms, and also through the language to create really a connection between the community and the profession. Because today to hire an architect is to be in a very privileged situation. So I think it's important to incorporate all of those local practices and to think also of new ways of speaking about the profession and having specific terms to pinpoint the work.
it's an excellent comment to wrap up on for this session. Also, because you have a conversation after. But absolutely, I mean, perhaps thinking about architecture beyond our Eurocentrism involves thinking beyond what we think of as architecture. So, which is already a question people do even within the sort of hegemonic metropole, within the capitals of the world. What is the role of the profession? Even here. So it's a question that happens everywhere. So perhaps it's a very opportune time to rethink the very term and the very nature of the profession. Just as by way of a few concluding comments, I think what's so central to this conversation is facing the stark reality and not being naive about the role of institutions as a conduit to practice and to professionalism. Right? We talk about the dissemination and influence that comes with that, the leveraging of style for some kind of authority when one goes back to home, or sort of Reba dictating permissions across the world. And so one must be sort of not naive to the political economic reality of practice and the dearth of practice. And that at least to an extent, certainly to a large extent, I would say, architecture is in the service of capital and ultimately power. And so we must not be naive of the power of leveraging that and the necessity of the individual who seeks to build a career when they leave their education and deserves to, because they put a lot of time and energy into it, to find their leverage. So only when one understands that interface, I think, can one really start to dismantle the problem, and indeed rethinking what an architect is crucial to that transition from the institution into the world and into making. And then just to add, secondly, if you go to the roots of the Spivak tradition of post-colonial thinking, to Gramsci, he gives us this wonderful word, praxis, which is the marrying of theory and practice as the way that one can generate the space for organic intellectuals that operate maybe beyond major canonical ways of thinking. So how does the maker, the global maker, the everyday maker, maybe become central to what we rethink of when we reconstitute the profession? He would have said homo faber as opposed to just homo sapiens. So as we sort of destabilize expertise without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but build up new forms of sort of organic expertise, I think maybe one direction is praxis, so the act of making, as a genuine, proud, sort of dignified part of being an architect. On that note, we're going to pause for coffee or tea, and then come back for an open discussion. I'd like to thank our speakers, Ingrid Schroeder, Golnar Tajdar, and Rashid bin Shabib for illuminating talks, and thank all the guests for questions and for being here so late. So thank you very much.